All right, taking a look at how Iran might respond to these latest Israeli strikes. Remember, this was Israel's way of responding to Iranian missile strikes back on October 1st on the country. But you know this goes. Every strike begets another counterstrike to address that strike, and back and forth they go. Kirk Lippold knows this region of the world quite well. Of course, you remember him as the USS Cole commander. He joins us right now. Commander, always great to have you. I guess it is the neighborhood, and you're quite familiar with that neighborhood. But what I do notice, Commander, and I'll defer to your pedigree excellence on this, you're not seeing outrage expressed by a lot of the what I call the more moderate Arab countries, nothing coming from the UAE or Egypt or, Saudi Arabia ripping Israel a new one, condemning the attacks and the escalation. But that's about it. What do you make of that and what it might signal for Iran?
Well, right now, Neil, good morning, and thank you for having me on. I think what you're really seeing is benefit of the Abraham Accords, and kind of the overall picture throughout the Middle East is one where there's a recognition of Israel's right to exist, but the United States has also given assurances to a lot of these countries that they recognize that Iran is the enemy in that region, and that the U.S. is going to back those countries who are willing to either not respond or only mildly respond to Israel's right to defend itself, which they did. So you're really seeing some of the benefit pay out over time, and you're not going to get much of a reaction because we've given assurances to countries like Saudi Arabia that we will help protect their oil facilities and their ability to export oil to the world.
The president has commented on this, Kirk. Joe Biden saying that it looks like Israel really didn't hit anything except military targets. That does appear to be the case. He also said that he hopes that the Israeli strikes against Iran are now the end. Now, of course, Iran's foreign minister has indicated it's not the end. He's promising a response of some sort. What do you think they do?
Well, I think what you've seen at this point is the Iranians should still be doing battle damage assessment to determine how badly they were hit. In a number of cases, like I hope they would do, Israel did strike facilities where there's dual benefit. Number one, they took out some of their missile production facilities and the industrial infrastructure that supports that. They took out the drone facilities and did major damage to that one. Plus, while they did not strike oil or nuclear facilities directly, they took out a lot of the air defense systems that protect them. That means those facilities are vulnerable and clearly would be in the next target set. If Iran responds, Israel then would have an absolute right to go after those, even if the Biden administration were to oppose it, because at some point those facilities need to be taken care of in order to ensure that Iran pays the price.
Were you surprised that Israel didn't go after those type of facilities? I'm talking nuclear or what have you. Now, I know they're deep underground, and not everyone is quite sure where some of them are because they can be moved around. I don't know. But it was very clear when Benjamin Netanyahu said that it wouldn't be going after oil facilities, maybe the fear there that it would lead to skyrocketing oil prices the world over, not just for damaged facilities in Iran. So the two things that would do the most harm to Iran, Israel didn't do.
Well, I think it was very wise of Israel not to strike those facilities. Number one, because the Biden administration and the world would have probably turned against Israel if they had done that. What they've done now is create the conditions that should Iran choose to respond, up the ante, expand the conflict, Israel is going to be able to justifiably go after those types of facilities to make sure, because one of the things that Israel is trying to do right now, and what they did with the strikes last night, is try to reestablish deterrence. And if Iran chooses to strike back, clearly what Israel did not send a strong enough signal to the Ayatollah and the president, who, given that they tried to attack Netanyahu's resident and him directly, they are now legitimate targets as well. That's another target set that was left off last night. They did not take out any of Iran's leadership. That will be in the next target set if Iran chooses to escalate this and expand the conflict, despite the world wanting to try and de-escalate, reestablish deterrence, and not have an expanding conflict.
All right, we'll watch it very closely. Kirk Lippold, the former USS Cole commander, again, no specificity out of the Iranians exactly how they would respond. They are promising to respond. As a backdrop for this, oil prices ahead of this attack this week were up about 4%, a little bit north of $71 a barrel. So none of the frightened or at least crazy sort of terror fear that you see in markets when it looks like there's an all-out escalation of hostilities. That could change. It's just one small pocket of potential reaction, but all of this was pre this attack overnight.